Okay, let's start with the types of meristem now. So these meristematic tissues or meristems are of different types on the basis of their origin and on the basis of location. So on the basis of their origin, they are differentiated into two types. They are primary meristems and secondary meristems. Secondary meristems. I am showing primary as this one. I am not writing primary. Secondary meristems. Okay, on the basis of location, these meristematic tissues are divided into three types. They are apical meristems, intercalary meristems, and lateral meristems. Okay, now let's start with primary meristems and secondary meristems. Let's study these primary and secondary meristems, which are divided the meristems which are divided into two types as primary and secondary meristems on the basis of origin. Okay, let's make the comparative study of this primary and secondary meristem so that it will be very much clear to you. Okay, so primary meristems and secondary meristems. Primary meristematic tissues and secondary meristematic tissues. Secondary meristematic tissues. Okay, primary meristematic tissues are the tissues which are derived directly from the embryo or from the derivatives of embryo. So these primary meristems are derived either directly from the embryo or from the derivatives of embryo. Directly from embryo or from derivatives of embryo. These are called primary meristems. Derivatives of embryo. Right. Okay, so these primary meristems are present in plant body from the beginning of plant life. So these are present in plant body from the beginning of plant life. From the beginning of plant life. Okay, so these are meristematic tissues. Now primary meristems means meristematic tissues. So when these meristematic tissues, primary meristems, undergo cell division, what happens? They form some group of cells. So these cells which are formed from primary meristems, some of these cells which are formed from primary meristems, they lose their capacity of cell division and undergo structural and functional modification and get matured into permanent cells to perform a specific function. Okay, so the cells which are cut off from primary meristems, cells which are cut off, that means which are formed by the cell division of primary meristems, are losing the capacity of cell division. So they lose their capacity to divide and undergo structural and functional modification. Undergo structural and functional modification. And get matured into permanent cells. So a group of permanent cells together form a permanent tissue which is involved in performing a specific function. Okay, functional modification to form permanent tissue which is involved in performing a specific function. So this process of formation of this permanent tissue from the cells which are formed by meristem, primary meristem, is called as differentiation. So this process of losing the capacity of cell division and get matured into permanent cells is called as differentiation. Okay, for example, chlorenchyma. Chlorenchyma is nothing but the parenchyma which consists of chloroplast is called as chlorenchyma. That chlorenchyma is involved in performing a specific function, that is photosynthesis, that is synthesis of food. So like this, different types of permanent tissues are formed. Aerenchyma, which helps in buoyancy, floating of the plant over the water surface. Like this, different types of permanent tissues. Primary permanent tissues, that permanent tissue which is formed from this primary meristematic cells is called as primary permanent tissue, right? So these primary permanent cells, primary meristems are present at root apex and shoot apex. Generally, as they are present at root apex and shoot apex, they are involved in increasing the length of plant organs, increasing the length of shoot and increasing the length of root. So the function of primary meristems is to increase the length of plant organs, length of root and shoot, that is nothing but primary growth of plant body. So they are involved in increasing the primary growth of plants. So this is the function of primary meristems. Now let's study about secondary meristems. So these secondary meristems are the meristems which are formed in the later stages of plant life, that is during secondary growth. So they are not present from the beginning, they are formed during the later stages, that is during the development of plant. So secondary meristems are the meristems which are formed during later stages of plant life. Okay, during what stages? That is during secondary growth. Okay, now let's see how these secondary meristems are formed. Okay, so primary permanent tissues are formed. Now, some of these primary permanent tissues regain the capacity of cell division. How they are formed? By losing the capacity of cell division, these primary permanent tissues are formed. So, by regaining the capacity of cell division. So, this is primary permanent tissue. So, some of the primary permanent tissues regain the capacity to divide, regain the capacity of cell division, capacity to divide and they become secondary meristem. So what is the function of this secondary meristem? Ultimately, meristematic cells undergo cell division and form cells. And now the cells which are formed from secondary meristem, again they re-lose the capacity of cell division and undergo structural and functional modification to form secondary permanent tissues which are involved in performing specific functions. So what are the examples of primary permanent tissues like epidermis, cortex, pericycle, endodermis, and even primary xylem, primary phloem, pith? All these are primary permanent tissues. Secondary permanent tissues examples are secondary xylem, secondary phloem, cork, secondary cortex, lenticels. All these are secondary permanent tissues, right? So secondary meristems are formed from some of the primary permanent tissues, not all the primary permanent tissues. Some of the primary permanent tissues which regain the capacity to divide and become secondary meristems. So this process of regaining the capacity of cell division is called as de-differentiation. Losing the capacity of cell division is differentiation. Now regaining the capacity of cell division is de-differentiation, right? So de-differentiation. Okay, now what we discussed, so the cells which are formed from secondary meristem. So secondary meristem undergoes cell division. So the cells which are formed from the secondary meristem, what they do? They re-lose the capacity of cell division, and undergo structural and functional modification, and get matured into secondary permanent tissue. So now what is this process of formation of secondary permanent tissue called? It is called redifferentiation. So this process of formation of secondary permanent tissue is called as redifferentiation. Okay, now these secondary meristematic tissues are involved in increasing the diameter of plant organs, like increasing the diameter, whereas primary meristems are involved in increasing the length of shoot and length of root, that is primary growth of plant body, whereas secondary meristems are involved in increasing the diameter. That means they are showing isodiametric growth of equal growth on all the sides of the plant organs, that is root and shoot. So secondary meristems are involved in increasing the diameter of shoot and even root. That is nothing but increasing the girth, which is also called as secondary growth. So secondary meristems are involved in what? Increasing the diameter of plant organs. Diameter, which is nothing but secondary growth of plants. So this is all about primary meristems and secondary meristems. So in this video I explained about, I just want to recollect these points once again. So we studied about primary meristems and secondary meristems. So the cells which are formed from primary meristem undergo differentiation into primary permanent tissues. Okay, let's recollect these points within a minute. So primary meristematic cells, the cells formed from primary meristem lose the capacity of cell division. So they lose the capacity to divide and get matured into what? Primary permanent tissue. So what this process is called? Differentiation. This process is called as differentiation. Right. Now some of these primary permanent tissues, they regain the capacity of cell division. Already they have lost the capacity of cell division, but some of the primary permanent tissues like cortex, general cortex and pericycle and even medullary rays, like that we'll be studying all these points, like what are the primary permanent tissues that are able to regain the capacity of cell division in the forthcoming part of the lecture, that is during secondary growth. I am just giving brief introduction of this primary meristems, primary permanent tissue, secondary meristems and secondary permanent tissues. So they regain the capacity of cell division. Some of the primary permanent tissues regain the capacity to divide and get de-differentiated into secondary meristems and get de-differentiated. So this process of formation of secondary meristem is called as de-differentiation. Now these secondary meristems, the cells which are formed from these secondary meristems, again relose the capacity of cell division. Relose the capacity to divide. Relose the capacity to divide and get matured into secondary permanent tissues. Secondary permanent tissues. So now the process of formation of the secondary permanent tissues is called as redifferentiation. Redifferentiation. Okay, now in this video we studied about primary meristems, primary permanent tissues, secondary meristems and secondary permanent tissues, and how they are formed by the process of differentiation, de-differentiation and redifferentiation. And we also studied in detail about primary meristems and secondary meristems. And in the next video I will be explaining about different types of meristems based on location, which are differentiated on the basis of location, position, where they are present in plant body.